Lucy's in the waiting room. Is it live on Facebook now? Oh, you're on mute there, Hannah.
I'll just make you a host, Payman.
It's been a while, Hannah.
It has. Payman, I'm struggling to find you. Oh, here we go. Make host.
Thanks. Are we live, by the way?
We are live.
Okay, exciting.
Okay. And we're just waiting for Paul now.
And should I just let everybody in? And we can make it up?
Yeah. I can't see Paul on here. Yeah.
You're on mute, Hannah.
Oh, hi everyone. We're all here now. So thank you for coming to our first workshop. And let me hand over to Lucy Powell, who'll be coordinating the first part of it.
Thanks so much, Hannah, and thank you everybody for joining us this evening on what is quite a sunny evening here in Manchester. I don't know about where you are, so I've just hot-footed in from eating a barbecue, so if I've got any bits in my teeth, that'll be the food I've just eaten. So, but thank you for taking the time to do this. I'm not sure I'm going to be organising it because I'm not as organised as Hannah, but I'll do my best. So I'm Lucy Powell. I'm the Labour MP for Manchester Central, and I was one of the commissioners of the Labour Together report. We first sort of came up with the idea of doing the report just sort of immediately after the general election, partly from my own experiences actually with my involvement in the 2015 general election, when I think, you know, like in 2019, we were very sort of collectively shocked and you know, really upset as a party and as human beings really about those election defeats and, you know, the nature of them as well. But in 2015 we hadn't really taken the time to understand sort of why we lost. We sort of quickly moved into a leadership contest, and you know, and then the you know, things changed, and we never really reflected on that. And I think we thought that this time we really should do that. So that's what the report was about. And we drew commissioners from right across the party, because one of the things that we really wanted to make sure that we did was that this was a collective process. So it wasn't so even just about the conclusions of the report, which we'll come on to in a minute, but it was about the process of arriving at a report like that, which was involving all parts of the Labour Party, activists and the public as well, and people with a whole range of views, so that we could have some kind of process of collective reconciliation and collective understanding. Because I think, I'm sure lots of people on this call will think this as well, you know, that whatever you think, the rights and wrongs of it, you know, we have spent the last sort of few years as a party, you know, at odds with each other at times, and, you know, instead of reflecting on what we have in common, you know, we focused on what we had that wasn't in common, and that was certainly something that fed into that election defeat. So I hope some of you read the final report, and you're here ready to kind of have a conversation about it, because that's what this exercise is about. It took us many months to come up with the report. We had 12,000 submissions from activists and party members, from councillors. We had in-depth interviews with people from right across the party, staff, as well as candidates who lost, MPs who lost seats, from the whole range of people in the Labour Party. And we think that the way it's been received actually is a sort of testament to the work that was put in and the recommendations that we've come up with, because it's been widely received right across the movement, from, you know, if you want to call it left to right, or whatever, from various sort of different factions and from none. And I think, you know, we're really proud of that. So this workshop today is about the recommendations that we made about future political strategy. So I just want to say a little bit about how we arrived at that as well. We've got Paul Hilder, who's on the call with us from Data Practice, and their work really did underpin our report. The work that they did on the 2019 election itself, and the voter flows and how they came about, and some really deep analysis that they did on that, but also looking at the future and how we might build a winning coalition of the future, and what that winning coalition would look like. So just a quick sort of recap. That one of the things that we found in our report, that the 2019 general election result and defeat was a long time coming. Anyone who, I mean, of course, we know that Brexit, leadership, and the manifesto in terms of lots of different policy announcements all at once, of course, they all played their part in that election defeat. But actually, the long-term trends towards that 2019 election had been a long time coming, and we really track those through the report. That's about demographics, geography, place, education, cultural divides, and all sorts of things that have kind of have changed over the years. But the key thing we wanted from our report was, we didn't want it to just be a council of doom, a retrospective. This is what happened in the past, and you know, there's an inevitability about it. We really wanted to make a very active sort of viewpoint about what could happen in the future, because I'm sure, like all of you, you know, we as commissioners, we profoundly believe in the Labour Party as an agent of change and as a force for good in this country. And we believe that the Labour Party has a positive, successful sort of future, and we wanted to set out and chart a path for that. So that was an underpinning. So we drew on lots of work, lots of the interviews and everything that we did, but on two really big pieces of work when we looked at this sort of political strategy of the future and what that winning coalition, the work that Paul Hild is going to talk to you about in a minute on the sort of different, what he calls different voter tribes, we call different voter groups, you know, what are their value sets, what are their outlooks, what are their concerns, what are their priorities, and how might we span and build a really broad coalition across a wide number of groups of voters as possible. And then secondly, we did this quite sort of what we thought was quite a unique exercise, which the polling company, focus group company, Britain Thinks did with us, where we asked them to bring together in a much more deliberative sort of fashion former Labour voters, many of whom only just switched from Labour in the 2019 election, many of whom live in small towns in the north of England, who had, most of whom had voted Leave in the Brexit referendum, or were Leave, what we call Leave-minded, brought them together for a day and a half with people who still vote Labour, many of whom were more Remain-minded, if you like, and lived in the sort of urban centres where we've become particularly strong as a party. So we brought together these two groups, and it was quite I went and sat through the whole exercise because we took part in Manchester, and it really was you know, very informative and eye-opening. And we asked at the beginning of the session, we kept the two groups separate, and we asked them to form a sort of political party of their idealistic political party. And then after, at the end of the first day, we brought them together and we said, no, you can't have the political party of your dreams. There's been a hung parliament. You've now got to form a coalition government, taking your different priorities and your different hopes and fears, and make that into a future government. And it was sort of, and then we threw the Labour Party in. It was very, very interesting, and there's a lot more detail in our report about that. But it was these two exercises, the work that Data Practice did, and the work of what we called a sort of citizens' jury, that really helped us to understand and form our recommendations as to what a political strategy, a successful political strategy for the Labour Party could look like, to span all, because we picked those two groups because we think that they're possibly the most divided sort of aspects of our historic coalition. So just quickly, before we go on to the discussion, I just want to quickly summarise what that sort of political strategy would look like. The first thing to say is that people, whether they're Leave-minded, former Labour voters or current Labour voters or whatever, I'm sure you'll all agree with this, you know, they really want to know what we actually stand for. They want a positive agenda that is understood. They want a clear agenda. And you could in fact say, in many ways, that the success of the 2017 election, which again wasn't really properly understood or objectively analysed, was that we had a very clear positive offer in that 2017 election that really mobilised lots of different voter groups. So we've got to set out an agenda of what we are for that is positive, and that speaks to the whole country, not just part of it. And that the political strategy sort of going forward, this is a very common theme that we found, that people across these different voter groups, they want the Labour Party to be the agents of big change, particularly big economic change, to their lives, to their communities, to their workplaces. And we have to be the party that really rides the horse of that big change. That the change that we offer, though, has to be rooted in people's lives, and showing that we understand people's concerns and hopes, especially of the voters that we've lost. We don't just dismiss their concerns, but we do understand them, and that our offer of change is relevant to the places that people live in, and understands place in a way that perhaps we haven't talked about before. So, you know, not just big grand national policies, but policies as they would affect my high street, my family, my workplace, that kind of thing. And finally, that the public need to know that the Labour's leadership is credible and can be trusted and is up to the task of governing. So we had a long list of kind of recommendations about how we might do this, but we we think we need to have a sort of clear agenda that brings that sort of political strategy to the fore, and that's something that I think all members could get behind, and people that previously had voted Labour. If we bring people together and build these sort of bridges, as we did in that exercise, and we take this approach and we think about it as we are today to CLPs right across the country, to just think through what a political strategy like that, what that might actually look like as we think about the next election. So I'm going to leave it there, Hannah, because I don't want to be too long. Sorry. And are you going to introduce Paul, or am I?
Yeah, happy to. Or do you want to introduce Paul, and then I'll help do questions? We're having to be a little bit ad hoc today, but we're okay.
No, that's okay. Hannah's brilliant at doing all this technical stuff. So yeah,
Well paid.
We're going to hear now from Paul Hilder, who is the CEO of Data Practice, which is a fantastic sort of polling and political research company, and they, as I say, worked extremely closely with us and have previously done lots of work for the Labour Party, most recently in the run up to the 2019 election. And Paul really is one of the thought leaders on these issues. So no pressure, Paul, but over to you.
Fantastic. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm going to attempt to share my screen and show you a few pretty slides. And as I do that, I will say it was a great pleasure to work with Labour together on this. I found it very cathartic personally, having done some work, not as much as we have liked, in the context of the general election, which I think everybody involved would acknowledge was what the Americans would call a goat rodeo. Google it if you like, but it was a challenging environment in which to be campaigning, and to be able to understand exactly what happened and to think about the future was, as I say, cathartic and also clarifying for us. So I want to talk about the Future Voter Coalition through the prism of what it was that happened in 2017 and 2019, so that people understand, both how things were, the coalition was assembled in 2017, which did quite well, and how things fragmented in 2019. And that then gives us a sense of what the future might look like. We're actually in the process of talking to Labour at the moment about what kind of framework might make sense 2021, next year, the big local elections and the nations and regions, and also through to 2024. We might reboot this a bit, but that's a live conversation. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see my slide that says Labour Together, the Future Voter Coalition. Shout if there's any problem with that. I'm going to move on now. If I can, hang on. There we go, to the first slide. So what this shows you is basically the vote share for Labour in 2017 and 2019 across the various different voter tribes and how that changed. Let me explain very quickly the methodology here. So there's a technique that's used in data modeling and analysis called cluster analysis. So you basically take the best part of 100 different variables from a poll, and you look at the patterns of correspondence between people's views. And there are people who are more socially traditional, more left-wing economically, maybe more anti-establishment. They might land in one tribe. People who are more economically right-wing, more socially liberal, more pro-establishment might land in a different tribe. So we found 14 different tribes from a piece of research we did, which had about 10,000 respondents. And this is how the vote share mapped out in 2017 and 2019. What you'll see here is that the green left, which was really the core Corbynite tribe, also a tribe which tends to include most Green voters, a large chunk, although not all, of the SNP voters. And you'll see that the Labour vote share was 79% in 2017, 79% in 2019, held up almost perfectly, as you'd expect in a core tribe of that kind. The second tribe, really interesting and important group, the Progressive Cosmopolitans. So this group, the majority of them were for Labour in 2017, In the Europeans, almost 60% of them voted for the Lib Dems or the Greens. So they were your classic sort of Remain tactical voters, more prosperous, a little bit older. And then at the beginning of the 2019 campaign, when we did this baseline research, again, the majority of them were voting Lib Dem or Green, but they swang over the course of the campaign. They were one of the key groups who were persuaded over the course of the campaign. Still, Labour ended up a little bit down, 3% down among that group. There were more significant losses among the centre-left pragmatists. These are people who are have a mixed set of social views. I'll go into the detail on each of these groups in a minute. So they have a mix of sort of moderate, progressive and more conservative or traditionalist social views. They're not hardcore left, but they're sort of centre to centre left. So there was a -8% in that group. Anti-Tory heartlands, this is a group who are more likely to live in the sort of red wall areas. You'll see a 10% drop in that group. They're quite left-wing, this group. They didn't swing to other parties. This was not the Labour to Tory switches. This was a large chunk of the people who ended up abstaining, who were 2017 Labour voters. This group plus the younger groups were significant sources of abstention between 2017 and 2019. And that group has more traditionalist views. They're more likely to be anti-immigration, for instance, and about half of them were Brexit voters. Then you have the three younger groups, young-ins to progressives. So this is a really interesting group, distinctive from all other tribes because the majority of them, unlike any other tribe, are on Instagram and use Instagram pretty much every day, 60% of them. They're mostly under 29. A lot of them were new voters in 2019, which is why you see this big rise in Labour vote share. It's not that suddenly all of these Tories suddenly started voting Labour. It's a lot of them didn't vote in 2017, either because they were not eligible or because they were abstaining at that point in time, but they are social media radicalized progressives, mostly social liberal, a little bit left wing as well, but very likely to tactically vote. Again, at the beginning of the 2019 campaign, they were overwhelmingly voting Liberal Democrat or Green, and then they swang behind Labour over the course of the campaign. The two harder to reach younger tribes, younger disengaged and the young apathetic waverers. The apathetic waverers just have very few strong opinions about anything and tend to be Labour Tory switchers. The younger disengaged tend to be non-voters who, this is one of the groups in which Labour had success in both 2017 and more significantly in 2019 in driving turnout. But those two groups, as you'll see in a minute, their social values are more mixed. They are not your rabid social progressives that some people would paint them as. They have a mixed set of views on immigration, for instance, and also on some of the other social issues. Then you come to three tribes. So there's the older Brexit swing voters, and you'll see the huge crash there, -22% among that group. And these were people who were, a good chunk of them historically, Labour or Labour Tory swing voters, and they moved away pretty decisively from Labour in this election. That was a significant chunk of the Labour leavers who went to the Tories. The other Labour leavers who went to the Tories fell into these two following groups. The older disillusioned, actually mostly non-voters at this point in time, but you see a big drop in that group. And then the nationalist ultra-Brexiteers, or we actually, in the Labour Together, we renamed them the anti-establishment hard Brexiteers, which I think is a equally legitimate wording. And that is the sort of the classic Faragist UKIP type voter who would have voted Brexit Party in the European election in 2019, but then came back to the Tories. Some of them would have historically been Labour voters, although not a huge amount, typically a smallish minority. 15% was, I think, the high point among that tribe. Older establishment liberals, really interesting group. Majority of them were Tory in 2015 and 2017, but then the majority of them were Lib Dem in 2019. But you see that Labour's vote went up among this group. This wasn't because they loved Jeremy. It was a really sort of gritting your teeth tactical vote on the Brexit front. Pragmatic Tories, again, mostly centre-right group, not as virulent and as the Faragist types, or there's another group who are just sort of establishment Tory Brexiteers who Labour has almost no vote share in. This group, you know, Labour got 77% of them in 2017. Again, I think Brexit was probably a factor in that, but then collapsed to 2% in 2019. And our qualitative research, we had tens of thousands of open-ended responses of what do you think about the two campaigns. It's very clear with this group that that unfortunately views of Jeremy in the programme and other things were a significant factor in pushing them away. And then the sort of grumpy group of older moderate traditionalists who tend to be just voters of habit for the most part. And Labour hung on to those reasonably well, but lost some of them. So that gives you a sense of roughly how things shaped up in terms of the difference between 2017 and 2019 and how Labour's vote share fragmented over that period. Those are headline numbers. They conceal a lot of churn. So there were some people moving to and fro. About a third of the Progressive Cosmopolitan group switched from Labour to Lib Dem or Lib Dem to Labour between 2017 and 2019, and so on. But it gives you the overall picture. So then if I move on, if I can find the right button, here it is, to this slide. This is really interesting and important. I'm going to take a second on it. This is about fundamental value sets. So one of the questions we ask, and we do this question all over Europe actually, it's a question that's based in the moral foundations theory of an academic called Jonathan Haidt, is we ask what are the factors which are most important to you when evaluating who to vote for, and there's a handful of factors. The main ones are highlighted in this table: protect the weak, treat people fairly, loyalty to the people of the country, in this case people of Britain, and prevent chaos and maintain order. And what you'll see here is that there are really two tribes for whom protect the weak, which overall value. There are two tribes for whom that's really significant, and another 5 for whom it's almost significant. Treat people fairly is really a consistent value which we find right across groups and tribes, although frankly people have different interpretations of this. So the sort of more left-wing interpretation of this value is equality of outcome and all that sort of thing. More right-wing people tend to interpret this value as more about proportionality to each according to their deserts. So that's a nuance which is worth understanding. But then what's really important to understand is these other values: loyalty to the people of the country and preventing chaos and maintaining order. Very, very significant, both for 2 of the younger tribes and for all of the swing tribes, except for, question mark on the loyalty for the people of Britain among the older establishment liberals, who are, as you would expect, cosmopolitan globalists, like me. I'm a progressive cosmopolitan, just joking. This gives you a sense of just different worldviews, which I think is really, really important. I think that there's a great failing of politicians is often that they try and view the world through their own lens, and they're blind to anyone else's value set or worldview, and everything gets interpreted through your own worldview. The other failing on the other side of things is triangulation, where you just say, oh, well, what do people think out there? I'll just follow them. I'll blow in the wind. I'll do whatever they want. In my view, effective politics lies in the combination of values and principles and deep beliefs and understanding of where the people are at who you aspire to lead and serve as a politician. So that is a hell of a balancing act, though, as others on the call understand better than I do. So that's the value set point. But I would just say, you know, whenever I would watch a Jeremy speech, like there was a beautiful principle to the way in which he would constantly talk about the homeless and protecting the weakest and all the rest of it. But I think that that was one of the things that would turn people off who came from some of these other tribes, which is not to say don't, you know, like those are good values and things to hold true to. But the question is, how do you tell a political story which helps people understand, you know, where you will take the community in which they live. And this is where that loyalty to the people of the country comes in, which is not necessarily a nativist perspective. So I'll just skip through these and give you a little flavor of them. I think probably more interesting than the details of every table is the discussion that we're going to get into in a minute. But this gives you a bit more color on the 4 core tribes. So in the end, in 2019, 70% of Labour's vote came from just these 4 out of the 14 tribes, which in itself gives you a sense of how it was that the voter coalition started to break apart. And you'll see there the factors that drove them towards or away from Labour. This came from large-scale message testing that we were doing through the election. Unfortunately, views of Jeremy, but also a lack of trust in Labour to lead the country were major blockers for the anti-Tory heartlands, but also the Brexit tribes, as you'll see in a minute. Brexit was definitely a factor. Lots of reasons which could have led them to vote for Labour, and lots of reasons for hope, even among the people who were lost. I will move on and show you the next slide, which is probably more interesting. So then the 3 younger tribes here, you'll see, if you look at the social attitudes row here, the difference between the strongly progressive young insta-progressives and then the sort of more mixed social views of the other 2 young tribes is really important. This is something I would constantly have to talk about with young Corbynites who I was working closely with. A project we did called the Real Change Lab, some of you might have seen, with Matt Zarb-Cousin and Michael Walker and Ellie Mayo-Hagan and other people. Is that not all young people are like them. You know, one of the most challenging data points that we found was the extent to which actually the younger, there was a huge cohort of younger voters who turned out in 2017 for Labour who didn't turn out in the referendum and often hadn't turned out previously, and they were mobilised and excited. And the majority of those people ended up not liking Jeremy Corbyn by the 2019 election. And a lot of them, about half of that group, didn't abstain, they didn't vote in 2019. So this group really important, or these 3 groups really important, and it's always important. Like, think about like electorates as an iceberg, and often the group that you see first is not the group which looks like the group which is above the water. The group which is below the water can be very different. 3 Brexit tribes. So you'll see here 8% of the electorate, that older Brexit swing voters, and 10% was that anti-establishment hard Brexiteer, the Farageist group, and significant collapses among both of those, and the extent to which loyalty of the people of Britain is their top value. Just get Brexit done was a big factor with them. They wanted a new tough immigration system, just like Corbyn, all that sort of thing. But also, you know, big chunks of these groups wanted a change of government and cared about health and the NHS and so forth. And when we go down underneath with these groups, there are a lot of things that they believe in, like the anti-establishment hard Brexiteers, quite passionate about things like nationalisation. You know, there are a lot of left-wing views in these groups that you can tap into. I think there's more detail on this in the report, and will be more detail in a follow-up data report that we will be issuing soon. So then the 3 centre-right swing tribes. The older establishment liberals, this is really, as I say, it was sort of like almost a Cameroon Tory group, liberal centre to centre right, swung heavily behind the Lib Dems last time, honestly, if you look at the first past the post system in the UK, we probably need a lot of these people to continue voting for the Lib Dems and try and get some of them to vote tactically for Labour. Otherwise, they'll end up with the Tories and we'll be, we'll be in trouble. One of the reasons why I think that a Lib Dem party, which at least rhetorically positions itself in the centre ground, is probably not a bad thing for progressives in the UK. Very interestingly, order is a key value for them. They really didn't like Jeremy. We asked what's the worst outcome of the election, Jeremy Corbyn-led government or a hard Brexit, I think it was, and 2/3 of them said Jeremy Corbyn would be worse than a hard Brexit, which is just an indication of how bad a place we were in with some of the electorate. Then, you know, the other groups, and the older moderate traditionalists, they're a very grumpy group. They often like not answering questions, which is always hard as a pollster. But there's a sort of I've met these people on the doorstep. They're quite relational. You have the right conversation with them, you listen to them the right way, and you tick enough of their boxes, they will vote for you, even if they are very grumpy in the face-to-face interaction. But they're an interesting group. So finally, I mean, I'm just going to show you this again, which is how things shaped up in 2017 and 2019. We ran 3 scenarios for the Commission for Labour Together, trying to map out, okay, what do future scenarios look like in terms of the electoral coalition, and we assigned some arbitrary numbers, but they were based on pretty good guesses, and we didn't think that a sort of going for the red wall and the Leave voters first was necessary. Of the voter coalition. We also looked at the possibility of a more, it's almost a sort of a Blairite position of go for the centre on the economics and stay socially liberal, but do some stuff like tough on crime to try and get some of the more conservative people behind you. That again didn't seem to us like it could overpass the 2017 result. The scenario that we thought had the most potential, which I think the Commission also agreed with, was a scenario which was more about strong transformational economic policy, so keeping that piece from the last few years, maybe making some tough choices about what are you going to prioritize first, because part of the overwhelming feedback we found in the research was that the plethora of promises led to a lack of credibility, and people said, oh, I don't, you know, you're not making any tough decisions, I can't trust you, it doesn't feel credible, and they ended up not believing any of it. But you know, going for something which is clearly prioritized, deliverable, transformational on the economic side of things, while finding a path to bridging the social divides. So not making a, you know, not choosing either the ultra liberal socially or the ultra conservative perspective, but trying to keep a broad social coalition together, which is a challenge we see for progressive parties right across Europe right now. And that seemed to us like the scenario which had the most potential, both to bring some of these older Brexit swing voters, maybe even some of the ultra Brexiteers, anti-establishment types back into the fold, while also holding on to the young and the Green Left, the progressive cosmopolitans, and possibly winning over a few more of those centre-right swing tribes, who are people who, I mean, if you look at some of those people really care about good governance and decency. I think decency is an important word, and a kind of a perspective and a value set which I think Labour potentially has an advantage in the medium term. So politics is not just a single spectrum from left to right. It is a kaleidoscope. I hope this perspective has been helpful to everyone. Looking forward to the discussion.
Brilliant. Thanks, Paul, and thanks, Lucy, as well. And thank you, everybody in the chat who has been chatting. What we're going to do now is I'm going to open up, if my computer will let me, the Slido, which is how we've been taking questions. So if I kind of just say a question, and then Lucy and Paul, do you want to kind of come back on that? So our kind of top rated question, let me just check and refresh this to check it's right, is from Alan White, which is, should Labour commit to backing electoral reform? Well, should Labour commit now to a formal electoral pact with all progressive parties for the next general election? If so, should this include a commitment to a form of PR? So that's kind of the first question we've got. I don't know if, like, Paul, you might want to answer that one.
I know Paul has some views on this, so I think Paul is best placed to answer this because I've heard his.
Yeah.
Sovereignty of the Congress, Lucy. Look. I mean, cards on the table. I believed for a long time, from a pragmatic perspective, that this is probably essential for Labour. Is the nature of the fragmentation of progressive groups in the UK, and of the of the electorate, and of the progressive political ecosystem, is something that has undermined representation in Parliament through the first past the post system, election after election after election, and generally when Labour won victories, it was because that had been organised in a slightly better way through one means or another, generally behind the scenes. The question of, like, specifically, what is the sequencing of this? Look, my view is we need to there's just been an earth-shattering set of events in British politics and society, from Brexit to the 2019 election to coronavirus. And I think we need to let some of that shake out. I think that one of the disadvantages, like, as somebody who's believed in electoral reform for a long time and worked very closely with many big electoral reformers, I am conscious of the fact that sometimes the electorate looks at people talking about electoral reform and says, you're just shuffling the deck chairs on the deck of the Titanic, and this stuff doesn't really matter. Talk to us about health and education and crime and the economy. And at the same time, I think people are increasingly realizing that there's something broken in our politics, and that Conservatives winning landslide majorities on a minority of the vote is not necessarily good for the country. I think it takes a more grown-up politics, and I think I'm hopeful that over the next couple of years, that Labour, the Lib Dems, Greens will be able to get themselves more organised in England and Wales, so that they have an interoperability, so they can clunk click and make the right decisions in the right ways. Some of that happened in the last election, but unfortunately in a more anti-Labour way than anything, which was not constructive. And we called out things that happened in Stroud in our post-election report in no uncertain terms, where the Greens cost David Drew the seat. And that wasn't the only case of that in their so-called Remain alliance. But look, I mean, I think this is a serious strategic imperative for the next 4 years, and I think it will take time. I think that we'll be lucky if we're there in a year's time, and it might take 2 or 3 years, and we might have to do some things more informally than formally. But look, it's hard to see how. I really, honestly, I am Labour. I've been a candidate for General Secretary twice. I believe in the party. I believe in its vision. It is hard to see how it wins a majority in 2024 without getting creative.
Shall I just add a couple of things to that, if you don't mind? I mean, I think there's a few things I'd just say, just to just keep the sort of reality check in there as well, which is, and Paul sort of made this point, what he was saying was that this kind of so-called Remain alliance in the 2019 election actually cost Labour seats. So it doesn't always sort of work in that way, because a lot of the time we are sort of fishing in the same pond. I think, as Paul's just said, and I completely sort of agree with that, one of the things we found really strongly is that the electorate want to see sort of political parties that have very clear agendas that relate to their lives. So wanting electoral reform, I've always been for electoral reform as well myself, might be something that we collectively sort of want to do, but it should never, I personally, my own personal view is that should never be front and centre of what our sort of offer is. And if we sort of go down that rabbit hole, I think it will be a challenge for us. But as Paul rightly says, I mean, just again, these facts and figures are in the report, so please have a look at it. But just to put it into context, to win a majority at the next election, we have to win 123 seats. That means increasing our number of MPs by 60%. That has never ever happened in history before. And if we don't make any real significant gains in Scotland, and this is where these issues come in, particularly in Scotland, if we don't make any particular gains in Scotland, we'd need to win Jacob Rees-Mogg's seat in North Somerset, you know, the heart of the Tory core vote, in order to win a majority. And even to be the largest party, we'll still need swings that are of the order of the swing that was achieved in 1997. So we do have a massive mountain to climb, especially when you look at the Scottish context in addition to that. So of course, sort of constitutional issues are there, but I think, you know, it's not a resonant issue for the public, electoral reform. That's the harsh reality of it, even though it might be something that is of particular importance to us as party members.
Great, thanks for that, Lucy. And for those kind of differing perspectives on it. The other thing, so the next question we've got is from Andy, which I might put to you, Lucy, which is, what do the panel believe are the best public spheres which Labour could use to engage in debate with people of a different political spectrum? So if we're talking about all these different groups that we're going to have to win over, what are the kind of spheres in which Labour could start to do this? And in particularly, like when we're thinking about our local parties, what kind of spheres could we start to do this work in? So Lucy.
Yes, thanks, Hannah. Well, look, we really had a lot. We talked about this a lot as a commission, and we have a number of sort of recommendations in the report. One of the things that we found we did some very deep analysis and work around the digital sphere, and how really the Conservative Party sort of massively outgunned us in the digital sphere. I think we like to think we're really good on social media, but actually they penetrated real voters much more effectively on social media than we did. And that's in part because we operate a lot of the time on Twitter, and on Twitter that's often us talking to ourselves and not talking and engaging with real people and voters. And so Facebook is a lot more effective for that, but we've got to stop thinking about these things in terms of, we say our thing and we broadcast it and we just hope that people are going to like it. You know, we do need to do a lot more direct engagement with people on social media and off social media as well. One of the other big recommendations of our report was that community organising has to be a sort of one of the central sort of components of what our campaigning looks like going forward. I know there's been lots of debate within the party about community organising. We certainly found that community organising wasn't embedded properly, wasn't kind of integrated properly, done well, you know, in touch with communities on the ground, you know, community organising and showing that the Labour Party is a voice and a vehicle for change locally, you know, is really important as well. Because what we also found was that a lot of people blamed, you know, Labour locally and Labour in their area for some of their disaffection. You know, we would hear time and again from members of the public, well, I've voted Labour for 40 years and, you know, things still haven't changed around here. You know, so they wanted that change, and actually Labour was seen as the establishment to them, not as the agent of change. So that's one of the things that we that we really need to sort of get across. But we made some recommendations. I mean, we really do think that relational politics, so having an ongoing dialogue and an ongoing relationship with people, has to be the core of our campaigning. We had a quote in the report from Ruth Smead, which I thought was a really good quote, the former MP for Stoke. She said, "I love doing door knocking and I spend all my time doing door knocking, but I have no idea whether it has any effect at all on the outcome of an election." We're kind of, you know, as members, we sort of have ways of working and things that we like to do, and we sort of happily go off and do them. But how much impact do they really have when you only have, you know, say a small number of people actually out door knocking? So one of the recommendations, which I know the new General Secretary, you know, has really taken on board, is that we need to have a proper sort of audit of that and a real look at that. You know, what are the kind of activities we could all be doing as activists that would make a real impact on the outcome of an election, not just in a few weeks before an election, but all year round campaigning, and that's built on relationships and built on sort of community organising that's done online and offline in the same way. Hopefully that answers.
Perfect. Thanks, Lucy. Do you have any thoughts on that, Paul, or shall I move on to the next question? Paul? Did you have any thoughts on that one?
We've lost Paul briefly.
We've lost Paul briefly. Okay. In that case, I'll go on to the next one that's come up, which is an interesting question. It says, could Labour win in shire areas if it had a proper rural policy? And if you don't mind taking that, Lucy, that's sort of thinking about how do we create a kind of more rural policy that's open.
No, absolutely. Well, look, I mean, again, look, one of the things that we found that the report makes really clear in the first part of the report, that's the retrospective kind of look, is that the electorate is very volatile across all voter groups, you know, much more volatile than it has been. I mean, this has been a growing trend over many years, but it's now a much more volatile electorate. And the whole idea of, you know, people having voted the same party all their lives and that kind of thing, you know, that is diminishing quite quickly. And Brexit and a few other things has accelerated that process even faster. So we shouldn't see any voters as sort of no-go areas in my view at all. And some seats that we never would have even conceived of winning, you know, are now, you know, safer seats than seats that were Labour a long time ago. We have this map that we've done in the report, a map of the 1983 electoral map after the election, when we had a similar number of MPs. We had around about 210 MPs then as well, and a map of the seats that we hold today. And there's about 80 seats that we hold today that we didn't hold in 1983, because the kind of Labour core vote, if you like, has shifted so significantly. So we had loads of seats in Scotland, lots of seats in the North and Midlands that are now quite safe Tory seats back in 1983. And conversely, we hardly held any seats at all in and around London or in the south at all, but certainly not in Greater London. And now we hold loads of seats in those sorts of areas. So, you know, demographics change, politics change, and we should never see any parts of the country as no-go areas. And I think maybe as well, you know, what's happened with coronavirus, and we touch on this a little bit in the report, you know, obviously a lot of that happened before we'd done most of our we'd done most of our research. But what's happened with coronavirus is, you know, in many communities, especially say tourism communities, communities that rely on certain sectors, the sectors that have been most hard hit by the economic consequences of the coronavirus impact, and the fact that the government are not standing by those communities. You know, and I'm now Shadow Business Minister, and I'm trying to speak sort of very strongly for those sectors and those communities that have basically had the rug pulled from under them by this pandemic, and the government are now leaving behind. So, you know, things could and will change very quickly, I think, coming out of the situation that we're now in as well.
Okay, thanks for that, Lucy. Paul, do you want to come back in on the previous question and then also that question if you want to say anything? Paul, if you're here.
Yeah, I'll do this question and then you can remind me of the previous question because I was actually kicked out when it was being asked. But on this question, look, you know, things are always changing. So I'm right now at my wife's family's place in between Truro and Falmouth in the West Country in Cornwall, and this used to be like true yellow Lib Dem territory. And even at the beginning of last year's election, you had people like Best Written coming out with tactical voting guides saying that Lib Dems were the best placed anti-Tory party in Truro and Falmouth, which was rubbish. Labour had done very well here in 2017 and ended up not far behind the Tories, despite a lot of cross currents, but with a lot of fucking Lib Dem votes still, excuse my French. And you know, there are chunks of the South with what I would call, you know, the new working class and significant numbers of younger voters, which are opening up to Labour at the moment. There should be no-go areas. It was somebody said in the chat at one point that Rees-Mogg's seat actually was won not too long ago, I think a couple of decades ago by Labour. No-go areas, but also you know, we need reality-based political strategy. As well as a politics of ideals, and we need to figure out where we actually can contest and win in the next 4 or 5 years, and then invest over a long period of time, rather than. And one of the greatest pieces of political malpractice that the Labour Party executed over the last 3 years for me was not digging in and working really seriously in some of the key swing seats, or indeed understanding which the key swing seats would be over the coming period. And the point at which during the general election last year, the Labour Party said, we are going to pull our resources out of Putney because we don't think we can win Putney. And I was watching the lines tracking and Labour was coming past the Tories at exactly that moment. And then Putney was the only seat we won. It's like, anyway, sorry. What was the other question?
Great. So the other question was, it was from Andy, and it said, what do the panel believe are the best public spheres which Labour could use to engage in debate with people from different political groups? So if we've got all these 14 groups that we have to try and cohere in some way, or choose some of them to cohere, what are the platforms and spaces and spheres? How do we do that? How could we do that in kind of local CLPs?
I mean, it's a combination of the old and the new, I think. I think that I'm actually a great believer in the town hall, or the kind of the big public meeting. And you call something, you bring a lot of people in, you can get a lot of older voters to those kinds of things, but sometimes younger voters as well, if you set them up in the right way. And you create a sense of occasion and community, particularly in town seats, which is some of the key swing seats now. But it's also the case that the large majority of younger voters you will never find on a doorstep. So you need to think about how do you get to those people through social media, through text messages, through actually, you know, sending people out to local parts or street corners with organizing approaches. You know, I think you have to be creative. You have to go and find people where they are. I also think that building direct communication channels with voters is critical in this day and age. We have a press which has a particular set of blind spots, and we need to, you know, we need to do everything we can to win the battle in the media arena, but we also need to go directly to voters and then organize with them. The final thing I will say is there is nothing that is more effective as a communications channel than somebody a bit like you from your community talking to you in a warm contact from somebody you know who is advocating for Labour. And this is where I've said, you know, for the last 3 or 4 years, Labour needs to try and get up to 1 million members. It needs to start recruiting in some of the communities where it's weak at the moment, and it's only through that kind of rootedness in communities that we will remember again the real diversity of the country which we seek to represent, and represent it more fully.
Just to finally add on that as well, Hannah, I mean, look, obviously I agree completely with the point about making sure that we don't spread our resources too thinly. So that would be a really dangerous sort of mistake to make there. But we also have to remember that our membership, and we look at this again in our report, that where our members are now, on the whole, not entirety, but where the big numbers of members are, and not where the seats are that we need to win, or the seats that we're most likely to win. So this work that needs to happen all year round and for many years in communities where they've maybe just lost an MP now, so there's a loss of like local leadership and everything. This is a really big challenge for the Labour Party. How do we get the human resource as well as the community resource as well as the sort of financial resource into the areas where we need to have a voice and a presence, when most of our members, most of our representatives, councillors, MPs and others are located elsewhere, and it's a challenge we sort of throw out in the report as well. You're on mute, Hannah.
Oh, I'm off mute again now. So that was really helpful. I think we're probably gonna have to wrap up questions now because we've got our kind of workshop to go through. We've still got like 30 questions on the Slido, so what I might do is try to compile those together, and we might try and come back with some responses offline. But I'd like to say a big thank you to Paul and Lucy for joining us today. I think that's been really helpful, and I don't know about you guys, but I've just found it really interesting and useful to kind of hear how big the challenges that we face, and also kind of what the actual data is behind what we're trying to win. And I think a lot about thinking about political strategy is about thinking through how we then can respond and how we as members can respond and actually get ahead and start to think about this. So I don't know if Paul and Lucy, you have any final words before we head off?
Just a couple of things really. I mean, one is, please, if you've not read it, please do try, and it's very readable, although it's many pages long, so lots of those pages are taken up with graphs and things. But the report as a whole will answer a lot of the things that are on the chat and a lot of sort of points that we've had discussion and questions with. So take it on your staycation and have it as a sort of something to read while you're on holiday. But the second thing I just wanted to say is, what a really important, for me, one of the most important recommendations that we make is around the process of political engagement that flows from our review, and the kind of the questions that it poses and the information that it has in it. And Hannah's been organising and taking requests for CLP meetings. We can either do, help facilitate Zoom meetings, or we'll come and speak at CLP meetings, or Hannah's got a whole kind of pack of stuff in terms of people being able to do local workshops and things like this, because I think the more that we all collectively can agree what are the issues, how might we address them, I think the more we can all focus on that central task rather than sort of disagreeing about what it is that we need to do, because I think it's pretty clear, and I think from the vast majority of Labour Party members, it's an agenda we can all sort of sign up to, but we just need to sort of all work together to make it a reality. So we're here to be part of that process and facilitate that and help you in your CLPs, whichever way you think best.
I think my closing thought would be there is hope. Like I said in the chat, there is hope. 2019 was a perfect storm of disasters for us, and that perfect storm is unlikely to be repeated. We could be hit by a completely different perfect storm, but this is where the optimism of the will, to quote Gramsci, comes in. You need to get your shit together. And I think that recognizing the strength in diversity, the reality is that Labour has a very, very diverse electoral coalition, and some of that is represented even on this call, and that is not approached correctly, that is not a weakness, that is a strength, because we share some fundamental underlying values and dispositions in terms of the way the world should be. We are, each of us, able to talk to different tribes, different groups in the electorate, and to persuade and convert them and bring them along with us. And the critical thing is for us to be together and united as Labour, not in a kind of superficial way, not in a way where we're afraid of having any disagreements. We can have robust conversations with each other, but fundamentally a kind of a decency and a quality of relationship and respect for each other across difference is, I think, critical in 21st century society and in the Labour movement.
Great, that's a perfect note to sum that up, Paul, in terms of what Labour Together is kind of trying to do. So I guess now we're going to move into the workshop side of this. So if anybody doesn't know kind of how we run Labour Together events, is we have sort of like presentations from people who are really interesting, like Lucy and Paul, and then we're going to move into a chance for you guys to talk to each other, because often I feel like, you know, on online events, people don't actually get to talk to other people, and you just become a box on a screen, and you don't get to actually talk to each other. So yeah, we're going to do that first. We've got a few volunteer scribes and facilitators on the group who will be around, and if they could just kind of wave. So if they're in your group, then they will kind of facilitate and then scribe, but also we are missing some facilitators and scribes. So if you end up in a group where you've not already got a facilitator or a scribe, we trust you, you're all adults. If you could nominate one of you to be a facilitator and one of you to be a scribe, and then kind of record what comes out of the discussion, because we're really keen to make sure that everything's recorded. And then if people could then send their notes to hannah@labourtogether.co.uk, and then my job is to compile these many notes. So that's how it's going to work. Payman, do you want to just run through the technical aspects of breakout rooms? And how you leave them and things, and then I'll set the first question.
Sure, no problem. I think basically you shouldn't need to do anything ideally. As soon as we open the breakout rooms, you will all be put into a room with around 6 other people, we hope, unless too many people leave at once. And if there are small rooms, I'll pop in and reassign people within the first few minutes of that. And yeah, like Hannah says, you pick your volunteer and scribe. If at any point you have any issues, you should have a button in your breakout room to ask for help, to flag up to somebody to come and see what's going on. Or if there's anything that makes you feel uncomfortable or anything like that, then you should have a button which you can hit to leave the breakout room and come back to the main room, where there'll be a few people around having a discussion, moderated.
Brilliant. So yeah, basic ground rules are be polite, be nice to each other, talk, and hope it goes well. The first question that we're going to kind of consider in our first breakout room is kind of, we've heard a little bit about what a political strategy could be to kind of get Labour into power, but this is kind of, I guess, a more operational question of how can we make sure that the political strategy is communicated to everybody across our movement. What would be the good methods to do this? How would you, as a member, like to receive a political strategy? Like, how do you know that we're all working on the same page and we're all kind of pulling in the same direction? So very much a kind of free discussion about those 3 points. So that's what our first kind of breakout room is gonna have a think about. And if you want to talk about other things, that's okay too. But if somebody can just kind of scribe and note down. So I think Payman is about to put us into breakout rooms, and we'll be doing this for about 20 minutes, and then we'll come back together, and then we'll go into another breakout room, and then we'll come back together, and then we'll have a third breakout room. So that's how it's going to kind of go. Yeah. Payman, are you ready to press the magic button that puts us all into groups?
So you're all going to groups now, and then there'll be a 2-minute warning near the end of the 20 minutes, at which point you, at the end of that 2 minutes, you'll be pulled back into the main room automatically. Okay.
How many people do we have still here? We've got 7.
Yeah, that's probably worked out pretty well.
Okay. So we could do a mini breakout room here with 7 of you if you want to unmute yourselves. Julie, Stephen, Peter, Kevin, and Tom. Are they able to unmute themselves?
Yeah, I've changed that.
Bro, if you guys want to take part in kind of a small breakout room here, it's also okay if you don't want to.
What's that for, Hannah?
Oh, hi, Stephen.
Hi.
We were just saying, like, if you want to take part in kind of a smaller breakout room with us here in the main room, then we can have a chat now.
I've posted the questions in there.
Cool.
Yeah, sorry, I missed. I keep getting kicked out. My line's not great to see.
Okay. Of course. So I guess like one of the questions is, how do we make sure political strategy is communicated to everyone? So like, has anybody got any ideas, like as a member, what would you want to kind of receive from the party? Is it a case of we label something our political strategy and then we make sure everybody reads it? Is that the best way of doing it? Hi, Stephen.
I'm just putting my hand up for asking.
Oh, okay.
To say something.
Great, go for it.
Talk over other people. Yeah, I think for me, it's not something I've dug into actually, but I have thought it now and again. Is what's the extent to which this report has been endorsed by the party itself? Has been, I mean, I know it's come from Labour Together. I've not read a huge amount into the background of Labour Together. I've kind of first come across it as a result of the report coming on stream and being published, which I think is fantastic. So that's inspired me to get more involved. But my kind of question is, to what extent has the NEC and of course to what extent have they bought into this report, either questioning it themselves or willing to work with you?
So I think I've got your question there, Stephen. You've kind of frozen with us, but you're saying sort of to what extent has the party actually endorsed what we've said? So I would say that like we've kind of been welcomed by lots of groups across the movement.
Yeah, have they bought it?
Yeah, very much so. And then I think the NEC are down to discuss it. So it's definitely tabled officially on the NEC agenda, and I think they have discussed it. And I know that the General Secretary agrees with pretty much all the recommendations that have been made in the report. So I feel like officially the party seems to have endorsed a lot of what we've been saying, which is really good. So I think it has definitely had a bit of a hearing at that level. So that is very encouraging. I don't know if you've got something to say, Tom G there. You're also with us.
Yeah, so I was like, in terms of the communicating strategy and stuff, like, is that as like to members or activists or to just supporters? Or
yeah, I mean, the question is kind of how do we do that? So like if you're a Labour member, like I think all Labour members are interested in political strategy, and how do we get everybody on the same page so that we all know this is what we're working towards. In this area, we're trying to do this and achieve this. And just, do you have any ideas of how to do that?
I guess my first thought would just be, I guess you'd need to have like local chairs and stuff running sessions on it in each area as low a level as possible, because obviously some people are going to read like Labour List every day, and some people are going to be trying to stay informed in different ways. Or other, also we're also in different echo chambers as well, so sometimes we're in different like sort of portals online or whatever. So yeah, probably best to like be organising that in the local meetings, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually, like making it at the lowest level possible, because I think so often it's like people miss big announcements, or it's like twisted in different ways on different forums. So doing something